Hello, I'm Helen Shapiro. Between 1961 and 1963, I was fortunate enough to have some hit records, including 2 number ones, You Don't Know and Walking Back to Happiness. I was 14 years of age when I had those number ones, and I believe I'm still the youngest female artist to have topped the charts. At least that's what they tell me.
So a secret it must stay, and you don't know how hard to bear. Whoa, since I've been away, I have loved you more each day, walking back to happiness. Oh yeah, said goodbye to loneliness. Oh yeah.
In early 1963, I headlined a nationwide tour featuring several well-known acts and a not-so-well-known act called the Beatles, who were on their first ever national tour of England. I thought John, Paul, George and Ringo were great. And when I first met them, Paul told me that he and John had submitted a song of theirs for me entitled Misery, but my record label, EMI, turned it down before I even knew about it. Shame, really, because it would have been nice to have been the first artist to cover a Lennon-McCartney song. While we were on tour, John and Paul asked me to listen to a couple of songs they'd just written, as they couldn't make up their minds which one should be the A-side of their next record. We got round a piano, and while Paul played, he and John sang From Me to You and Thank You Girl. I said I preferred From Me to You, and they were pleased, because that's what they were actually thinking. During the tour, Please Please Me went to number 1, and the Beatles were promoted from being my opening act to closing the first half. A year later, in 1964, they were the world's biggest group.
Can't buy me love. I should have known better with a girl like you. You know I feel alright.
This program is the story of the Lost Beatles interview and how it came to be found. Indeed, after 44 years missing, presumed lost, this is the first time it's been broadcast since. The interview was originally only seen by viewers in Scotland and took place in the studios of Scottish Television on Thursday, the 30th of April, 1964. 2 remarkable things have happened to make our story possible. The first was back in 1964. By sheer chance, it was recorded on a telecine machine. There were very few of these machines around at that time, and the high cost of 16mm film meant only the most important shows were archived. The copy I have here in my hand, inside this rusting old can, is thought to have been recorded on a telecine machine in London. So, if you were one of those far-sighted technicians, then for the sake of 9 minutes of pop history, may I thank you. The second remarkable thing is that this fragile film has survived the past 44 years at all. For most of its life, it's been stored in a damp garage in South London, just one of a pile of 64 unmarked canisters, unopened, unloved, and almost thrown away. To tell the story of the Lost Beatles interview, we'll hear from the original interviewer, hired by STV back in '64. One of the world's foremost Beatles experts looks back in time to understand what it means to unearth a hidden gem. And we discuss with a film historian the terrible tragedy of just why so many other classic interviews are missing, presumed lost. So let's go back to this damp garage in South London where the discovery was made. The man who found it, stacked among 64 unmarked cans, is Richard Jeffs. The film's now stored safely in a professional archive where temperature and humidity are carefully controlled. So its future is secure. It's a vast room with rows and rows of long metallic shelves constructed 3 tiers high. Each contains thousands of film canisters, and each can is carefully barcoded and stacked neatly in alphabetical order. Our can, on the other hand, is old and rusty, with a yellowing label slowly peeling off. It's stacked in a higgledy-piggledy pile along with the other 63.
You see, it's got sprockets down one side, isn't it? So, very delicately. There's the sprockets, right, that hold it together when it's going through the machine, when it's going through the the viewer, if you like. Opening the can even smells exciting somehow, with the chemicals that are in there that have stored the pictures. Look at the rust there, for God's sake. Immediately before they came here, they were in a damp garage in South London. 64 cans that were going to be thrown away. And I got to hear about them, and so was interested, and managed to get them somewhere safe. But as I say, we haven't looked in all 64 cans yet. We've only looked in probably 5 or 6 of them. But opening this, we found the Beatles interview. There's a bit of paper inside, which was the giveaway, which was Beat interview and the Beatles, but it didn't tell you where it came from.
But with a bit of detective work, using the scribbled label found inside the film can, Richard managed to decipher the names of the 2 presenters. But it wasn't easy. The handwriting was that of somebody in a great hurry and was incredibly hard to read. But patience proved successful. The hosts were Paul Young and Morag Hood. Morag later embarked on a distinguished acting career before she passed away in 2002. Paul, though, is alive and well. Back in '64, he was a children's TV presenter aged 19. He also went on to have a career as an actor. Paul recalls the day he was told by his boss what was about to happen.
We'd done 2 or 3 series when I got a call from the director of the programme saying that he wanted me in the studio the following day because we were going to do an interview with a group who were very well known at that time called the Beatles. So into the studio we went, and basically it was going to be a longish interview, which we'd never done really with the Beatles before, because they'd come on and played music, and we'd never really actually spoken to them on air. So it was decided that Morag would talk to John and Paul, and I would talk to George and Ringo. And because it was quite a long interview, and I think the director wanted to keep it nice and casual, so he had John and Paul sitting on chairs talking to Morag, but he said to George and Ringo and I, well, why don't you just sit down on the floor of the studio? So that's what we did, and I think it lent a casual air to the interview.
George,
Yes?
what difference is there since last June up to now? What sort of things have happened to you since then?
Well, everything's happened. The main difference is that we've got more money and less time to ourselves. You know, everything's speeded up and we're just running around like mad.
And which of the two would you prefer to have?
Well,
more money or less time?
More money and less time, I think.
My father was quite keen on home movies, and he gave me his home movie camera to take in, and I took some footage myself, which I've got on, which I've had transferred to video now, and I cannot believe how stupid I was to take so little. I mean, obviously there were time constraints in the studio because we had to get on with making the programme, and I perhaps wasn't allowed to take more. I can't honestly remember, but you would think that if you had a chance to photograph the Beatles in a television studio, you would film until the camera blew up, until you had no more film. But I've got some shots of John making faces at the camera, Ringo making faces at the camera, and just some general shots in the studio, and that's it.
George, if you ever manage to get away from the crowds, what sort of things do you like to do?
Sleep, see films, go to nightclubs, drive my car, and that's it. Play records, watch TV,
What sort of records?
just ordinary things.
What sort of records do you like
Listening to all my records are sort of American ones. People who you probably haven't heard of.
Thank you.
Arthur Askey, Bert Whedon.
And of course, although everything was sort of quiet and casual in the studio, outside Scottish television that day was absolute bedlam, because there were, I mean, literally, I think thousands of youngsters, mostly girls, outside the studios because they knew that the Beatles were coming to do the interview. I think police leave was cancelled. I know that STV, the kind of guys that were running the studio, they had hoses out ready to use in case they were needed. But the Beatles did actually manage to slip out of a back door and into a chauffeur-driven car and get away. But I mean, I think it was actually on the news that night, on the television news, that STV studios surrounded by delirious Beatles fans as they appear on Roundup. Gosh, I was part of that. Quite thrilling.
Do you find any difficulty in keeping up your public image? Just
No.
what image?
It's our image is just us, you know, as we were. We didn't try and make an image. It just happened, and so we don't have to keep it up. We just remain ourselves. Don't we, Ringo?
Well, we do. I mean,
We don't know
the
about
other two
that.
were worried about.
Jörg Piper is the German-born author of the Beatles film and TV chronicle 1961-70. He says this is the earliest British long-form studio interview that survives. In other words, it's rare. So what does it mean to a Beatles fan to discover a long-lost interview? The writer Mark Lewison is widely acclaimed as one of the world's foremost experts on the Fab Four. He's the author of the Complete Beatles Recording Sessions and the Complete Beatles Chronicle. Now, because this interview was missing, presumed lost, Mark has, of course, never seen it. Until now. We put him in a small preview cinema and turned on the projector. Mark spent about 15 minutes scribbling down notes in a small brown notepad and rerunning parts of the film over and over.
I think it's wonderful that it's turned up, and what you get from this interview is where they were at this day. They're up in Glasgow, they've just finished their film, they've been to America, they are the biggest thing on the planet. And yet here they are sitting on the floor in a TV studio in Glasgow with fans screaming outside, and they're pretty cool about it.
I've got Paul and John.
John.
And Paul talking to George and Ringo, the other two.
One of the interesting things for me is the way that the four of them are broken into two groups of two, and you've got George and Ringo sitting on the floor, and John and Paul who are, you know, they've got the chairs. And the John and Paul combination is, of course, the vital one, because the Beatles had this incredible thing going, this career that had taken off beyond all expectations. But in addition to that, you've got Lennon and McCartney as a songwriting partnership. In a sense, they have a separate thing going, because they're writing songs not only for the Beatles but for other people as well. So this was an opportunity for Morag to ask them about songwriting.
How do you write songs?
Well, you know, we just depend. Sometimes we write them on old pianos and anything that's lying around, you know. Old tramps.
Doesn't do the piano any good, does it?
No, it's murder getting into the recording studio. I've got a song, George, with a great big piano. But guitars and things, you know, normally we sit down and try and bash one out. But then again, there's no formula, because he can come up with one day completely finished. We still say we both wrote it down.
Well, I suppose it was quite unusual that they would answer a question in such a way where they revealed, I mean, the extent of the Lennon-McCartney relationship was such that they had this agreement that they would put both names on the writing of a song, even if only one of them had written it. So this agreement was from before they were making records. So whatever they were doing, it was Lennon-McCartney, or for a while McCartney-Lennon. And what Paul is saying here is that, you know, sometimes he would write a song, or sometimes John would write a song, but that they would always put the both names on it. I suppose it's quite unusual that they would say this, but they never made a secret of it. It was simply this notion took place in the public mind that Lennon and McCartney were like Rodgers and Hammerstein. That, you know, the one would write the words and one would write the music, and they got very bored very quickly of answering that question. So this was, you know, a candid admission, if you like, that the way their songwriting partnership worked was a pretty fluid one. It was whoever did anything, they would put both names on it.
When did you start writing songs?
I was about 2, I think. I wrote, "Pass me the bread, mother." Something like that.
No, it's more like when you were
about 13 or 14.
Yeah.
When I got a guitar.
Writing them seriously?
What was the one you wrote? Down at the pen.
Boom.
They didn't have a particularly high regard for the accuracy of their own history. I think they say they met at the age of 13, which was really, I mean, John was almost 17, almost 18 when they met.
Did you know each other when you were 13?
Yeah, that's when we met.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell us about the meeting.
At Woolton Village Fete.
I was
met
playing
him.
at a garden fete in the village where I lived, or
Playing
just
at
outside
what?
Liverpool.
Just
Playing with a group,
In a group.
the skiffle group. And he came along and we met. And
I knew one of his mates, Ivan, was sort of a mutual
very
mate.
complicated.
Hey, mutual mate of ours, and he introduced us and things.
There's something very charming about the way that they address the questions, and it's a very sweet interview, no question about it.
Did you prefer this time last year, or do you really like
No, I
the
like-
big time?
I like whatever's happening at the moment.
Yeah, there's good in both of the sort of stages. It was great then, and it's lovely now.
Despite whether people are rude or not.
Oh, I take that.
What do you think about people who maybe, didn't like you then, or said something nasty, or just didn't bother about you then, but are terribly nice to you now?
Well, we didn't bother about them then.
And we don't bother about them now.
Do you know something?
Well,
I believe it.
yeah, it's true.
Yeah, there is this amazing moment when Ringo suddenly lights up a cigarette, and viewed through eyes of 2008, you kind of, you think, oh my goodness me, look at that, he's lighting up a cigarette in a confined place. And then you think, hang on a minute, this is a children's programme. But nobody stopped him.
Has your attitude to fans changed since then?
No, there's just more of them to watch.
But they all scream when they're listening to you.
Yeah, but we love that,
Do you really?
Yeah, really. Because it, like in Edinburgh, it's Glasgow tonight.
Yesterday, that's
I shouldn't have said that, I don't know, I've lost track of time. Anyway, the atmosphere in the theatre, really, it's marvellous,
They enjoyed having fans. I mean, this is what they were in it for. They were in it for all the usual reasons, including having fans. But obviously, there were times when it could get out of control. I mean, they used to travel around the world with the smallest coterie of people. I mean, you get bands these days going with virtually armies of security guards. I mean, they used to go around with like 3 guys. They go to America with as a party of 7. But all the same, I mean, their attitude to the fans was such that, it could be intrusive if they allowed it to be so.
But you've made a film since then, and you just finished it.
Yeah.
Why did you make the film?
Well, it's a logical step, isn't it? And I believe it's quite lucrative, I believe.
Anyway,
it's
someone
expressed.
asked us.
Yeah, we were asked to do it. We said, yeah. And Alan Owen wrote it, and we changed it, and
It's called A Hard Day's Night.
Hard Day's
Your
Night.
local cinema now.
Not now.
Not now, soon.
I can't recall a previous occasion when they were sitting and being asked these questions. It was fairly common that they would be asked them like this on radio, but on television, probably not. They were being filmed all the time at this time. They had just been in America, and the Maysles brothers had done this great cinema verite piece with them, where they followed them around for several days, but not quite asking them about their songwriting or asking them how they felt about their fans, that kind of thing. So in that respect, this is a first, and all the more important, therefore, that it should be found.
John, about your book.
John.
How did you go about writing this book?
Well, sort of pen and paper and that. And that's about
In
it.
words, too.
I just sort of wrote it, the hobby.
Is this a stage that you went through, writing in this sort of garbled language that you have got out of now, have you?
No, there's a lot of it is quite new.
I was quite interested watching this interview how John is unusually quiet. Right at the very beginning of the interview, when Morag asked John and Paul the first question, John and Paul, they were very intuitive, and they would instinctively know who was going to answer it of the two of them, because it's being addressed to both of them. And John doesn't want to pick it up.
Nothing really. I think the main changes are in people's attitudes to you.
Now, Paul was a good speaker. Paul was always very good at answering the question, not necessarily with the fullest answer that fully answered the question, but it was an answer that would satisfy.
But it's people who change rather than you. We feel exactly the same, really. Got a new suit, though.
John always gave something that was more immediate, more visceral, deeper, and usually cut right to the chase, but sometimes he didn't really want to do it.
Well, they're either more polite or more rude, from one extreme to the other. Where's he gone? Classes.
And this is one occasion when you can actually see him just holding back slightly. He's comfortable, but for some reason, he's on a quiet trip at this point. But what you do get from John on a number of occasions, if you listen carefully in this interview, is just little moments where he drops into this kind of Edinburgh burr. And for those who follow the Beatles closely and have a lot of interviews in their collection, as I do, John often dropped into this Edinburgh accent, and the reason is he actually had spent a lot of time there in his childhood. Scotland was John's second home. In fact, just in the years before he died, when he hadn't been back in Britain for a while, he was asked if he missed England, and he said, no, but I do miss Scotland. And you'll often get him dropping into this Scottish accent. And he does it in this interview, just a little bit, but it's there.
Ringo, what's the most interesting person that you've ever met? I should say, who's the most interesting person you've ever met?
John Lennon.
George?
Harry Seacombe, I think. Harry Seacombe, yeah, he's great. I like him.
Is that the kind of person that you like?
Yeah.
Have you ever been frightened of your fans? A time when they've really frightened you?
Only
Paul's frightened me, if you don't.
only times when getting in and out of places, when there's 1,000 of them all together. But when you usually only meet about the most 6 or 7, you know, if you were sort of running along the road, and then there's not enough of them then, is there, to sort of make you
You don't mind that too much?
No.
It was rather nice to hear Paul mention the first song he ever wrote, which was I Lost My Little Girl.
Well, funny songs then. Mine was I Lost My Little Girl.
Which subsequently in the 1990s he began to perform.
Well, I woke up late this morning, my head was in a whirl. Only then I realized I lost my little girl. I said,
It's a special piece. There's something relaxed and laid back about it, which is quite unlike a typical Beatles interview of the period. They tended to be rather frantic. This one is almost so laid back it falls over, and it's a great pleasure for that.
You know, it's a terrible tragedy that so many classic interviews are missing, presumed lost. I have in my hand here a book entitled Missing Believed Wiped. It's by Dick Fiddy, who's a TV consultant for the British Film Institute. Dick, why is so much material from the early 60s lost?
There's a number of reasons why things are missing from the archives. Technology is a lot to do with it. A lot of material went out live, and therefore there was no way to record it. It wasn't recorded for a number of reasons. Then when videotape came along and there was a possibility of recording it, it was expensive, and the technology worked against it because it could be used again. And thirdly, things that were tele-recorded, i.e. this was shot from a monitor by a film camera, they were only really done if they could be exploited again, i.e. repeated, reused or sold abroad. So for a lot of the everyday television, it just was never recorded and is lost in time.
It's a shame, yeah. Well, is it important that these missing archives are found, though?
I think we've realised, as time's gone on, just how good a mirror to society television is. When you find these things, they tell you about the time in a way that a lot of books and even going back to newspapers don't quite. Over the years, many things that we now would think it's absolutely vital to keep weren't kept at the time. But somehow, like this Beatles interview, have turned up.
I'm very glad that they have.
I think they're all important. Almost everything that turns up, even if it doesn't have the cachet of having the Beatles involved, does at least tell you a bit about its time.
That's great. But does their being found, do you think that changes pop history?
I think with an interview like this, it nails down to a certain date some of the times when the Beatles themselves started talking about perhaps how they wrote. And also, it gives you another insight into the dynamic between the Fab Four, and that's always important. I mean, it's just like building bricks. Every brick adds to the overall house.
Now, earlier we heard from Paul Young, one of the two presenters. While we were in Scotland recording the interview, he mentioned in passing that he'd in fact never seen the interview. So, after 44 years, it was time to put that right. Today, Paul lives in a traditional Edwardian house in Glasgow, not far from the original TV studios. Sitting in a comfy chair in his basement living room, glasses perched on the edge of his nose and an excited smile slowly spreading across his face, we played the recording to him.
I've got Paul and John.
John.
And Paul talking to George and Ringo, the other two.
Goodness me, you'd think they could afford a proper set. You were sitting on the floor there.
Well, I said in my intro.
Now, I'm not sure whether we've pre-recorded this or whether this was going out live. They were at it all the time, John and Paul. They were always, you didn't know whether they were taking the mickey out of each other or out of you. Gosh, how young he looks too, doesn't he? I don't think we'd seen any other kind of long interviews with them before like this, in a sort of casual setting.
I like it all.
Interesting, no notes or anything, no script.
How do you write songs?
How do you write songs?
Well, it just depends. Sometimes we write them on old pianos and anything that's lying around, you know.
Oh,
Say we both wrote it down.
When did you start?
that's interesting that he could come up with one completely finished, but we still say we both wrote it. So obviously at that time, you know, they were writing songs on their own, but it's still Lennon McCartney.
Writing them seriously.
And he introduced us and things.
It's interesting. That's two kind of revelations: the fact that they wrote songs separately, but still put them under the Lennon McCartney banner, and then they met when they were 13. I don't think they'd said that on television before. Look at the old-fashioned microphone. Oh my goodness me! They're taking the mickey out of Morag. Interesting. I mean, there's Paul sitting with a nice, smart suit on and collar and tie. John just with a casual jacket and polo neck. Paul's got cufflinks on too. Very smart. Of course, it's in black and white, long before the days of colour, which actually lends it an interesting quality because you realise how old the recording is. He's being strangled at this moment by George Harrison. Wow. And there we are. Gosh, that's a bit mind-blowing to see all that.
So, the Lost Beatles interview. That was really good. Let's hope more unmarked cans of old film are discovered in damp garages across the UK. And actually, what was interesting for me was this candid admission of theirs on how they wrote the songs. Sometimes Paul, sometimes John, but they always put both their names on it. I think that's great. It was also really good to hear the dynamic between John and Paul in those early days. I mean, I remember that's how they were when we were on tour together, on the coach and in the hotels, and their wonderful humour, of course. But we'll give the final word to Ringo, who'd spent the whole interview sitting cross-legged on the floor.
Ringo, how do you feel about playing on stage and being showered with things like jelly babies, boots, girls, things like that?
Well, I'm lucky being at the back, you know. The other three have it worse than I do. But sometimes it's a bit of a drag.
It's not much fun, actually.
You know.
Knock you off your stomach.
Yeah.
Do you never feel lonely sitting at the back?
No, that's where I am, you see. The drummers should always be at the back.
Drummers should be heard and not
seen.